I'd just like to introduce, just with a few words, Marcus Collins, who's joining us from Loughborough, and is the author of Modern Love, which is, if you haven't read it, is a wonderful book about the significance of mutuality and companionship in marriage and relationships across the 20th century, and also the editor of the Permissive Society and its Enemies, which has a fantastic introduction which really complicates, I think, some of the sweeping conceptions and stories we tend to tell about permissiveness, which is also feeding into and underpinning Marcus's current work, which he's going to talk about today in a paper called The Permissive Society, Opinion Polls and Social Change in Post-War Britain. So, Marcus.
Thank you for inviting me. So, I'm just actually finishing a book off about these guys, the Beatles and 60s Britain. And so I spend a lot of time looking at the famous, the unrepresentative, and increasingly I've become interested, while doing this research, about the people in the background. In this case, in Abbey Road in 1969. So, what did they make of the social changes that the Beatles were assumed to personify? And, in other words, what is the relationship between permissiveness and society? Was there such a thing as a permissive society in this period? And to answer this question, I have turned to opinion polls. Like this one, which doesn't come out all that well, but this was an opinion poll which was conducted by the BBC, which was actually one of the big polling organisations in this period, and I should say that I'm moving on to doing a study of the BBC and permissiveness. They did this poll because they were worried that Alf Garnett, rather than being a salutary warning to people, was actually recruiting bigots to his cause. So they did this poll to find out exactly how bigoted the British population was in general, and in particular those people who watched the programme. And what I thought I'd do at the very beginning is to have a little opinion poll of our own, an opinion poll about an opinion poll. So I should say, okay, so these are the sorts of questions they asked, and they asked people whether they agreed or disagreed, and I am not asking your opinion of whether women's lib is a load of rubbish. I hope that would not be the sort of question that we would discuss in the august surrounds of the IHR. I'm asking you to transport yourself back into 1972 and have a think about how people might have answered it then. Okay? And I've tried to make it fairly easy by having, did 2/3 or more of respondents agree, disagree, or was it somewhere in the middle? Now, in the past I've used these clicker things, but I haven't brought some today, so I'm going to have to resort to a sort of 1972 technology, which is the hand. So if you fancy voting on this, what do you think people thought in 1972? So who thinks that there was majority agreement, 2-to-1 agreement with this idea? Okay. More evenly divided? Okay. Who thinks that there was a consensus against? Nobody. Well, that is from the last time I did it with clickers. So people were split down the middle on that question. People should not be allowed to live in sin. Did people generally think this in 1972, do you think? Anybody? Nobody? For that? I've got about half a dozen of these. If you get bored, just yawn demonstratively and then I'll get on to the actual paper. But I kind of like this. People were split on this?
I can split.
Most people disagreed. A few, but no real consensus within the room, I would say. And so, strong disagreement. What children need most is strict discipline by their parents. Well, I mean, clearly that's true, but did people in 1972 think that was true?
This is in England and Wales, yes?
This is in, I think it's Scotland as well.
Is it?
Yeah, no, I'll have to check, but they had a whole bunch of different survey posts. This was the great thing about the BBC. They just had the money to do it.
Survey of bigotry in 23 Western countries, Northern Ireland, and Greece are the most bigoted countries in the developed world. So that obviously.
One interesting thing is that none of the polls I'm going to show includes Northern Ireland. The polling organisations didn't touch Northern Ireland. I mean, perhaps because if you start question one, what is your religion in 1972, then this is seen as a bit of a loaded question. But no, Northern Ireland excluded, but the rest of Britain included. Okay, so agree? Divided, split? Disagree? Okay. Overwhelmingly agreed. So are we keeping a tally here? I would say I've done this talk a couple of times before, and no group has got more than a random probability. Okay, so no group has got more than 1 in 3 of these. Okay. So, mixed race marriage. Was this acceptable? Who thinks it was acceptable? People were divided on the matter? Disagree? Okay, so overwhelmingly in theory, in favour. I think this is the last one. A teenager should be allowed to decide most things for himself. Okay, agree? Divided? Disagree? Right.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. So the point of this, apart from delaying the inevitable, starting the paper, is that I'm trying to show that polls, first of all, don't provide definitive answers so much as they raise further questions. Why did people answer the way they answered at this point? What did they interpret as the meaning of these questions in the first place? And how do you explain the contradictions? As you've probably noticed, things didn't really go in a predictably permissive, anti-permissive direction in answer to these particular questions. And the same goes for the responses given to Gallup. Oh, I've got the handout here. This is slightly crumpled. It's a bit shop-worn because I've been travelling by train. But there are a few more here if you need. So what I've done here is I've colour-coded to sort of colour-code in a very broad brush way the things which are more permissive. If you approve of birth control, that's kind of a permissive statement of the time, and less permissive. So if you're into moral training, you could be more likely to be of a sort of authoritarian bent. And you can see they're kind of all over the place, right? There's no clear pattern.
Drama parties.
Yes, right. Yeah, well, at least level pegging with white superiority. A somewhat clearer picture emerges when we look in greater detail at specific issues, and especially at attitudes to legislative reforms, and that's why I've given you this handout. Does everybody have one? Okay. And this this answer, I think, questions what we mean by a permissive society. Now, what I'm going to suggest in this talk is that most people did perceive a permissive society as coming into being from the 1960s onwards, but that they disapproved of most of its manifestations, and that they opposed most of the legislative reforms. So Britain is becoming a permissive society in spite of itself, in this sense, during this period. Now, this differs a bit from some of the existing scholarship on the field. So Geoffrey Weeks has moved now towards a position in which he sees a increasing liberalisation, which he associates with a democratisation of everyday life. Okay, and this covers a broader time span than the one I'm going to be talking about here. I do have stats which go up to the end of the 20th century. For the purposes of this talk, I'll be dealing with the sort of long 1960s, basically. So another person who might be brought into the frame here is, Arthur Marwick, and his idea that permissiveness, as well as other aspects of the Cultural Revolution, were fundamentally a mass movement. Okay, that when you look at people in the early 1970s, they think and behave differently, very differently, to how they did in the mid-1950s. In the other corner, as it were, is Dominic Sandbrook, who has a continuity thesis. Okay, that although he talks a lot about the sort of cultural phenomena within the 1960s, he sees these as being essentially epiphenomenal. That Britain is a nation of gardeners, basically, and people sort of crocheted their way through the 1960s. Now, I think that opinion polls suggest that attitudinally, people perceived this to be a time of dramatic change. So in 1970, when they ask, over the last 10 years, have people's attitudes changed towards sex and marriage? A lot, 81%, say within a single decade there's been a strong change in attitudes towards sex. And marriage, less so, but still a majority. Let's take another poll. So this is from 1978, slightly outside of my period, but it's looking back on the previous 15 years, or 10 or 15 years. Has the situation of women changed? People overwhelmingly think it has changed for the better, okay? And even the second option, as it were, still suggests there has been change. So, in other words, I think that there is a strong perception of change, and that this has to be incorporated into our understanding of this period. The 1970s are different from the 1950s and 1960s because people thought that they were different. Okay. At the same time, I don't entirely agree with the sort of Weeks thesis in the sense that although I see the changes that I'm going to be grouping under permissiveness as being democratic in the sense that they are gaining fundamental human rights for previously marginalised or oppressed groups, it's not democratic in the sense of commanding majority support. So the revolution from below that Geoffrey Weeks talks about was conducted by minorities on the whole in the face of public disapproval. So, I've set out my stall. Now let me talk about the methodology. Okay. So judging on past experience, there'll be lots of questions about methodology in the Q&A, so I'm not going to go through the strengths and weaknesses of opinion polls in a great deal of detail. I'll give you a definition of permissiveness It's one which I'm fond of, by the editor of International Times in 1967. I'll also give you a set of the issues that I'll be looking at here. Those of you who have come for sex and nothing else today, I apologise. This is, in my view, permissiveness is a capacious category which includes a whole bunch of things which are associated with civil rights, fundamentally to do with personal behaviours on the whole, and that sexuality is just a subset of these. And I'm going to try and demonstrate some of that by showing that you can see that people who are sexually liberal are also liberal in other ways. Okay? The two at the bottom are the biggest stretch, including in permissiveness. Most people don't discuss these things separately, but what I've been saying in terms of conceiving of permissiveness as being a liberatory force and an anti-discriminatory force, I think that it's important to discuss immigration, race relations, and feminism and attitudes towards feminism, and what was then called women's emancipation more generally. I'll stop about 1975, so I've already explained why. The usual health warnings apply to the use of statistics here, but I'll put in a few more caveats. So the data are incomplete, they're fragmentary. There is no master source of all of the opinion poll data for Britain in this period. It's been collected here and there. A lot of the polls we only have top-line data for. Those which do allow for cross-tabulations I use in order to try and work out the differences between groups. And that'll be the sort of second half of the talk. These are descriptive statistics. I'm not doing any regression analysis here. I'm using Gallup, NOP, BBC, not British Social Attitudes, which begins in 1983. I'm using polls not simply as snapshots, as with the Alf Garnett poll, but where I can, trying to track series where polling companies ask the same question over a period of a number of years. But it's important to appreciate that the same question can be asked, but the context is drastically different. So this is a question which was asked by Gallup from 1959 onwards, and you can see that for every year, the people who think that the feeling between white people and coloured people is getting better, they think it's getting worse every single year. Okay, now this is bad enough news, but it's obviously something which is reacting to a very different situation from decade to decade. So with these numbers extrapolated from census data, you can see that in the 1950s, they're talking about a tiny non-white population. By the 1980s, it's still, from our perspective, relatively modest, but from their perspective, it has grown exponentially. Right, I'm looking at attitudes, not behaviours. And I'm looking at attitudes reported to pollsters. It's important to remember that almost all of these polls, the BBC poll was an exception, were conducted face-to-face by generally women, polling agents who would go out and talk to individuals on their doorsteps. They would go to their houses and say, you have been selected. Okay? We've heard a lot over the last couple of years about shy Tories in 2015, about their Brexit equivalents in 2016. Was it the case that people weren't saying to pollsters what they actually thought. Well, first of all, it's important to allow for the fact that all of the polls recently for the unexpected elections in the United States, in Britain, and Brexit were within the margin of error. The second thing is that if they were being shy bigots, as it were, they weren't incredibly shy about it. As you'll see, there were lots of antediluvian attitudes which come to the surface. Right, so let me get into a sort of overview of what I see as a predominantly anti-permissive sentiment throughout this period. So, women's emancipation, which we've talked about already, was one of the few positive developments perceived by people during this period. This poll about race relations is more typical of the sort of hell in a handbasket model that people have about direction of society. On religion, they were even gloomier, so they ask about whether the situation of religion is improving or worsening, and from the 1950s into the 1970s, you get more and more people talking about it worsening. If you ask more generally about the honesty and standards of behaviour of people in this country, you can see, I mean, this goes up to 1995. If you sort of continue the line, we are probably a sort of, minus 30% by 2017. This is demonstrative, I think, of a sense of moral malaise in the country as recorded through these opinion polls. Now, it's unclear how much of this perceived moral decline was attributed to permissiveness. What is clear is that, first of all, society was opposed to moral relativism and social pluralism on the whole. So in 1967, they asked 15 to 14-year-olds whether a group that tolerates too many differences of opinion amongst its members can exist for long, and 62.9% thought that it could not. So this is still a society which fundamentally, generally speaking, believes of itself as a homogeneous society. At the same time, there are signs of increasing moral uncertainty and relativism. So the same poll found that half of the population agreed that everything is changing so rapidly these days that one can hardly know what is right and what is wrong any longer. It's also the case that some, but not all, permissive phenomena score highly when respondents are asked what they found to be morally offensive, and that many of the same phenomena were perceived to be directly linked to the increase in crime. So, late 19th century, lots of talk about a crime wave, and when they give them options about what might be associated with this crime wave, a lot of these things are in one way or another taking people back to the idea of permissive change. So this was the context in which British people in the post-war period responded to the legislative reforms which are on your handout. And again, I've colour-coded these. Again, you're going to have to forgive the sort of blunt instrument of the colour code as being broadly permissive or anti-permissive in their intentions. Now, this goes past the period I'm going to be talking about today, but the first thing to note, I think, is that it's not the case that you just see a series of permissive reforms during the post-war period. You, in fact, have a series of permissive and anti-permissive measures being brought in. So the only Immigration Act that was in any way permissive was the British Nationality Act, and was not exactly intended to bring about mass non-white migration, even though it granted rights of citizenship to all members of the empire. Not all of these reforms I have data for. Those ones, basically, I don't have anything exactly contemporaneous with them. But for the others, we've got quite a lot. And let me start off with what are generally thought of as permissive measures in this period. You have surprisingly strong levels of support for some of the earliest liberalising measures. Although I should say a lot of these are from some years before. We don't have enough data. So 44% are in favour of abolishing flogging in 1938, something that comes in after the Second World War. 58% want off-course betting legalised in 1949. And 49% back the legalisation of attempted suicide in 1958. The 1960s do, in my view, merit some of their reputation as a permissive moment, to the extent that respondents, on the whole, were increasingly in favour of such things as equal pay for women, the decriminalisation of abortion, the decriminalisation of adult male homosexuality, state provision of birth control, and the liberalisation of divorce. On the other hand, you can see on figures like this about divorce that although the number of people who are in favour of making the divorce law easier rises in the late 1960s, just as the reform is going through Parliament, it never matches the combined numbers of those in favour either of more restrictive divorce laws when combined with those people who think you should leave it as is. And other polls on divorce in the 1960s provide complex and occasionally contradictory answers. Majority of the population was opposed to lowering the age of majority to 18. Respondents were split in the late 1960s about whether birth control should be provided to the unmarried. The abolition of capital punishment in the post-war period never attracted the support of more than a quarter of the population. And its abolition, as with the earlier abolition of corporal punishment, produced a backlash in the 1960s. So by 1961, 71% wanted the restoration of flogging and birching, and people were actually keener in the 1960s on parents slapping and teachers caning their children than they had been in the 1940s. There was strong public opposition in the 1960s to recently enacted laws liberalising gambling, obscene publications, and the question of race relations brought still more unpermissive attitudes. So those polled, that's the gambling and pornographic material stuff from the 1960s. So those polled on the Race Relations Act of 1968 were split down the middle over the general principle of whether or not it should be illegal to discriminate against people because of their colour. And the reason I put this up is that it's quite a good measure of discrimination. So when people are asked, would you vote for a well-qualified parliamentary candidate who was different from themselves, you can see that in some of these cases there's a slightly greater tolerance by the mid-1960s, but it's still the case that close to half of the population say they wouldn't vote for a non-white or non-religious person. Okay, so that's the permissive legislation. What about what I've broadly called the anti-permissive legislation? Well, basically, with one exception here, it was all popular. Does anybody want to hazard a guess as to the one exception?
Clause 28.
Clause 28 was lamentably popular.
The Gaming Act?
The Gaming Act, no.
the video recordings. I don't even know what that is.
That was
It's video.
you're younger than you look. Video nasties, yeah.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, so that's Driller Killer
Right,
and,
no.
and all of that. No, that was...
Was it the pirate radio?
You are on the money. Yes, so the banning of offshore radio in 1967 was opposed by a majority of people. But immediately afterwards, when they saw how great Radio 1 was, the numbers tightened. But all this other stuff, really popular. So this banned American horror comics, okay, in 1955. 71% thought it was a good idea. The Street Offences Act, so the attempt to implement the Wolfenden proposals on prostitution. People were generally supportive of this, but almost half disapproved of its tolerance of call girls who remained off the street. There were massive majorities in favour of every new restriction on non-white immigration. 88% were against reducing the penalties on the use of cannabis, as proposed by the Wooten Report of 1969. And so you get the idea. Governments which go to the country on the basis of trying to restrict things and tighten things can, generally speaking, rely on backing. Those that introduce more permissive measures will provoke controversy, if not downright opposition during this period. So that's the period during the implementation of these measures. What about when they are implemented? Do people kind of accept these things, come to terms with permissiveness and the measures? So if Britain can be perceived as being a permissive society without a permissive majority in the 1960s, did a permissive consensus emerge shortly thereafter? So, as I've mentioned, I'm only going to deal up to the mid-1970s, and I'll also now introduce something which is drilling down a bit more into the groups of British society and their relative levels of permissiveness or otherwise. Right, so we go back to these blurry people in the background, and basically they're the types of people who are more likely to be permissive in this period. In other words, young, metropolitan, male and middle-class people. Okay? So I'm going to run quickly through these. What I've done here is X is marking the more anti-permissive subgroup, okay, within each of these groups. So were younger people less permissive than older people? If so, an X will mark the spot on these particular issues. Okay, so pretty clear. Where you have blanks, it's because there was a sort of draw between the two. Okay, so fairly decisive results there. If you're an older, less skilled, female conservative voter, then you are likely to be anti-permissive in 1970, according to this poll. Going back to the Alf Garnett poll, whole basket of issues here. Another case of older people being more anti-permissive. Women again incline more towards more conservative views on these social issues, and it's the unskilled who join them. Okay, and then this is a poll conducted by Gay News, or for Gay News, I should say. I'm not going to leave you in suspense with this one because we've got more categories. But again, you see the same thing. Okay. And then when you asked before about regions, this is giving you some answer to that. These are television areas, because that's how people did things on polls at that point. Clearly you've got multiple categories here, so it's not a binary thing like men or women where you have a greater preponderance. But you see Scotland, Wales and the West, so the so-called peripheries as being slightly more anti-permissive. People who didn't have children under 16 on this poll came out as being less permissive. My guess is, and obviously this is something which I can research because we do have the raw data for this, is that just means that they were older on the whole. So I think that probably explains that. And then age finishing education, so the less educated were less permissive. Now, these are 3 polls. I now have gone through dozens of the damn things, trying to do these cross-tabulations, and I have got some numbers. Now, these numbers I only calculated while I was waiting for Dan and Matt. So I have the answer, but it'll be as much a surprise to me as it is to you, because I have no idea what I came up with. Oh, it's on my other computer. I'll just see if I can find those, but I'll carry on talking while it boots up. Okay, so you get the idea. By the way, how much longer do I have?
5-10 minutes.
5-10 minutes. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to go through issue by issue, or what I can basically do is just speak to the PowerPoint. I think is probably the best way of doing it. So we don't have a lot of data about these because when things are thought of as becoming more consensual, pollsters don't see the point in asking lots of questions about them. So the age of majority, for example, only comes back into play in the late 1980s when there's talk about whether the age of consent should be changed. People, generally speaking, think that illegitimacy is a non-issue from the 1970s onwards, and so on and so forth. Of these, I've basically grouped them according to the degree of anti-permissiveness. Okay, so the higher they are, the more reactionary sentiments they produce. So the opposition to the abolition of hanging is well known. Okay, and very interestingly, I don't know if anybody saw The Independent after Brexit did a poll where they asked Remain and Leave people whether they wanted to do things like, bring back imperial measurements. You saw this? Mm-hmm. Right, and so there was a strong relationship between people who wanted to bring back the rope and people who wanted to leave the EU. Maybe that was the reason they thought, well, they could hang to their heart's content if they got out of the EU. So this is still a live issue. In other words, there are still anti-permissive portions of the population which are sort of reliably reactionary in other ways. Okay. I've talked about the backlash against corporal punishment, abolition thereof. Even in the 1980s, most people are talking about how they would like to bring back the birch and all of that. Race relations is just a complete disaster area as far as polls go. You can see I'm improvising slightly here. Drugs, there is some distinction made between soft drugs and hard drugs, but basically there is an idea that soft drugs are a gateway to hard drugs, and it's only in the 1990s that you begin to have any momentum behind the liberalisation of drug laws. So yeah, this is race relations. So most people see immigration as damaging the nation. Okay. So drug taking, very high. We were talking about this earlier. Some things which you might expect as being seen as very serious social issues if you ran this poll now, like rape, for example, not very prominent. Others, paedophilia, not on the list. So there is, however, a liberalisation of attitudes towards public expressions of sexuality in the 1970s. I think Leon Hunt's work on British low culture probably captures some of that there is increasing tolerance of things like pornography in the 1970s, that things change in the 1980s. Divorce, abortion, attitudes don't really change at all after liberalisation. There's no real appetite for these things to be repealed or for the laws to be liberalised further. Birth control, there is an increasing acceptance of providing advice to unmarried young people, but note the expression of the question. It's about advice, it's not actually providing birth control itself. And this is another paper that there's some very interesting material about attitudes to second wave feminism, and broadly speaking, people think that emancipation is happening. They think that it's happening at roughly the same pace as they would like. There is not very much difference between men and women in attitudes, but what difference there is, men are slightly more feminist than women in the 1970s, and the women's liberation tenets, when they are put towards groups of women, are very largely rejected. And so, yeah, I'm concluding here with a poll from 1970 where people are looking ahead, what they think is going to happen. And so I've talked about how people think a permissive society is coming into being in the long 1960s. When they project ahead, they, broadly speaking, see it as intensifying in the future. But they also, broadly speaking, are not very comfortable with a lot of its manifestations. For many of these issues, they see this as an ominous development. So moving forwards, thinking forwards, as they move into the 1970s, they see trouble ahead. Okay, I'll end it there.